Hello, and welcome to or welcome back to How to Change the World, the podcast that equips changemakers with insights, tools, and inspiration to drive meaningful impact. I am Catherine Alonzo, and today I am joined by Representative Sean Camacho. Sean Camacho is the elected representative for House District 6 in Colorado, which covers the east part of Denver. And Sean and I have such a fantastic, important conversation about elected politics. Are politicians really as bad as we think they are? Why is it that it just feels like nothing is getting done to focus on and confront some of the problems in our local communities? And how is it that residents and voters can make a difference and can get in touch with those that are elected to represent us? Sean has dedicated his entire life to public service, and he always knew that was something that he wanted to do and something that he wanted to be. A graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, he served on multiple overseas deployments while on active duty. He is a lawyer by profession, but he knew that he wanted to serve in elected office. And so that's exactly what he decided to do. And I am very excited to share this conversation with you because I think he shares such incredible, valuable nuggets about what is going on in our world today and how we can drive change. Without any further ado, my conversation with Sean Camacho. Sean Camacho, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I am so looking forward to having this conversation. So, Sean, jumping right in, I am so curious, what possessed you to have a career in politics?
I often wonder that myself. I think, I have spent most of my professional life in public service. I went to the Air Force Academy. I spent 10 years on active duty, and then I deployed and continued to serve as a reservist and deployed all around the world, from Iraq to Afghanistan to East Africa to Colombia. And at every point along the way, I thought that public service was really, really important to me. It's something I focused on. It's something my parents were really big on, and I always felt like I had something more to give. So when the opportunity came for public office, I jumped at the opportunity. I'm very active in my community, and I just thought I had a lot to offer. So that was really kind of the turning point for me.
And what did you run for first?
Well, I ran for the same seat 3 times, and I'm currently the state representative for House District 6. So if you're not familiar with Colorado geography or politics, that is essentially East Denver.
And how many times were you unsuccessful before you were successful?
As they say, the third time is the charm. So I think the first time I ran was in 2019, and it went horribly. I was just so new to politics and so new to campaigning that it didn't go well. And then I tried again in 22, and as all things go, it just was not my year. And then I tried again in 24, and it worked out that time.
What did you learn along the way? Because I actually love that. I think there's so much pressure on first-time candidates, and there's this idea that if you lose, it's, this failure. And I think we overlook the fact that failure is a part of success. And so I'm so curious what you learned and what enabled you to keep going until you were successful.
Well, I think for me, it was perseverance really does matter. And if you really want to make a difference, you gotta stand in the room. You gotta be engaged and willing to do the work. And I see this from other candidates and other places. Now being an elected official, you can kind of see the life cycle of a campaign and how other people are doing it. And it's very rare, I think, that first-time candidates tend to be successful right out of the gate. At least in my experience. I mean, there are plenty of examples of that, but you're far more likely to fail. And if you're just willing to give up, then it'll never happen. You really have to put your mind to it and stay engaged. And I think that makes all the difference.
Well, and I'm sure that's probably true when you're in elected office too, right? Like, it's not like any of it comes without perseverance.
Oh, I think that's 100% true. I mean, I think you can ask any elected official in the country, were they successful on a big, significant piece of legislation, and they'll probably tell you no. Lots of the really big policies take a few years to be successful, and if you're willing to give up after that first shot, big change just never happens.
Yeah. And so, since being in office, what are some of the things you've learned about how to persevere within the legislative office that you hold?
I think for me, it is find something you care deeply about and just be willing to fight like heck for it. And I think when you're able to find that niche where you can really make a difference in your community or in a policy area, just pursuing that relentlessly makes all the difference, because it's really hard to be excited about something that you don't really believe in. And I think when you face adversity in those situations, you're far more likely to just push it aside and say, I'll just move on to something else.
What are some of the things that you care deeply about within your community right now?
Well, when I was campaigning, and it's true even to this day, I think the biggest issues in Colorado and East Denver are affordability, housing, and the environment. And a big part of the affordability piece is what our tax structure looks like. And that tends to be one of the sexiest topics that you can campaign on or talk to anybody about, because people are just banging down your door waiting for you to talk about tax policy. But the reality is, when you are a legislator, you're in charge of budgets and laws, and budget's a huge part of that. And it's nuanced and it's complicated and it's messy, and it requires lots of trade-offs. And if you're willing to do the work, then you can really, really create some difference in a community.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because it's so, I just think that all of us, voters, residents, have very busy, stressful lives. And so we have lots of things going on. And you don't always have the time or the resources to really understand and figure out all of the decisions that are being made on your behalf by elected representatives and how they truly make such an impact on your day-to-day life. And I think in Colorado, there is this incredible example of that in how your tax policy is structured. And so do you want to talk a little bit more about that and what you would like to do about it?
That is an incredibly perfect lead in. So in Colorado, we are the only state in the nation to have a taxpayer Bill of Rights. So for those of you who are not exposed to that, when you hear me say that, you're like, heck yeah, that's a great idea. I want rights as a taxpayer. The features of this, and we call it locally here TABOR, and the features of TABOR are that the government can only raise so much money. And if it raises money over an artificial cap, it has to return it to voters in the form of a direct check. And then voters get a say on any tax increase, not just at the state level, but the county level and the city level. There is not a level of government that can raise any tax without voter approval. And that all sounds amazing, because how they market it locally is it's a check on runaway government. But what we're seeing, TABOR was passed in 1992, and over those 30 years, what we've seen is Colorado has become a state that is least equipped to deal with the challenges of a changing environment. We simply we don't have the flexibility to invest in schools or roads or higher education, and we're falling behind. And I think this past session was a perfect example of that. We are facing a budget crisis in Colorado, and next year is going to be even worse, where all we can do is cut programs because we have TABOR, and any revenue we get over this artificial limit has to be returned and not used efficiently. And it's caused real impacts and opportunity challenges for citizens of Colorado. And I liked what you said earlier about nuance and different things, because what I found this session is that that's exactly what the budget is. And when you look at a tax increase or shifting money from one program to another, it's a really nuanced conversation and lots of complexities, because it requires trade-offs and amendments. And it's really not something that is effectively done on an up or down vote at a ballot, because there is no room for that conversation. And I think you get poor government as a result.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because how decisions about anything on any level are rarely a yes or no. And some things sound great on the surface, and then they have these unintended, or maybe not unintended, but intended consequences that aren't necessarily made clear to people. So I think that your explanation of TABOR is a really good example of that, in that who doesn't want these caps? Like, it sounds really good, but it just creates these limitations for the state that aren't perhaps as clear for folks.
And I'll take it one step further. I think the Colorado experience should be a cautionary tale, because I think over the last 30 years, there's been 8 or 9 states that have attempted a TABOR-like measure. And I think there's currently one playing out in Arkansas where people really like the message of, limited government, more efficient government, and getting to vote on tax increases. But here's where I think people should really take caution. When you're looking at something like Tabor or transferring from a representative to direct democracy, it's really a bait and switch. Because here in Colorado, the only time you get to vote on something is when somebody with enough money got to put it on the ballot. Because putting these different tax measures on the ballot are incredibly expensive. So what you really get is an up or down vote on something a special interest group put on the ballot. And in practice, what that does is it divests power from everyday voters that they can exercise through their elected representative and puts it in the hands of special interest groups that aren't held accountable, are not worried about the consequences of some of these ballot measures. And there's a perfect example from one of the most recent elections here in Colorado. We had this measure, it's called Prop 130 pass, and it was voted on by the people of Colorado, and it won overwhelmingly to give local law enforcement $350 million. In Colorado, we have a balanced budget, and this particular proposition didn't say where the money had to come from. So what we ended up doing is making really tough trade-offs because a special interest group put this on the ballot, not saying it was a bad or good thing, but voters voted for it without understanding where that money had to come from. And where it ultimately came from is one of the state retirement funds. And I think if you would have told voters, will you approve $350 million for law enforcement, knowing that that money is going to have to come from a retirement fund, the outcome would have been different. But there was no room for that conversation on the ballot because voters just got to vote yes or no.
Well, I think that's a phenomenal example, and really highlights the challenges of making these decisions in silos, because when you're making decisions about how to run your household or run your company or run your team, you don't make decisions without knowing the consequences of something and without making trade-offs between things. Very often in government, we do, because it's not the very reason that representative government exists is because it's not possible, right, for every single human being or every single resident of a town or a state to know all of the ins and outs and then make the decisions. Like, this is why it exists. And so how do you wrap your head around balancing those two things? Because there's shortcomings sort of baked into the structure of the system.
Actually, I'd like to just step back for 1 second, and I just want to acknowledge one thing. I think voters in Colorado, and I would guess in Arizona or across this country, are incredibly smart. And I think what we found is that voters really do care, and we have this thing called a blue book that comes out and gives the pros and cons of every piece of legislation. And when you talk to voters, they really, really dig into these issues and give it a lot of thought. We have we have mail-in ballots here, so you get to sit with your ballot for a while and really make those decisions. But there's a structural problem because you only get to make that decision in a silo. It doesn't mean you're not making a good decision. You just don't get all the information. So to your point, I think that's why representative democracy matters, because you elect people to go to the state house to have these discussions with community, interest groups, governments, agencies, all the stakeholders that go into making a budget decision that just does not play out on a ballot. And it's not a fault on voters at all. It's a fault on the system that we have. And I think that's really important to recognize. We're not in this problem because of voters. We're in this problem because we have a system that doesn't work.
Well, I'm really glad you highlighted that, Sean, because, working in politics as I do, there are two generalizations that you hear all the time. One is that all politicians are terrible, and the other and don't care about residents or voters, and the other is that voters aren't paying attention and don't care about what politicians are doing. And I have found neither one to be remotely true. And that, like you said, voters are smart and engaged and they care deeply. And there are challenges within the structure that limit the power of participation, or even how much, an informed voter can do. I think there are also challenges in the structure to how people view politicians. So I want to ask you, from your point of view as an elected official, what are effective ways that invested members of the community can communicate with and engage with the people that represent them?
So I talk about this often because I agree with you. I think when I was just Sean, not an elected official, I think there was a very, it's very popular or just very accepted to not trust politicians. But in my experience, politicians are just your neighbor down the street and people who've cared about community, and they're just trying to do their best. And it's a tough job. And I'm not trying to excuse I'm not trying to dismiss that, some politicians act badly. That happens. But I think the vast majority of my colleagues are really just there every day trying to do the right thing. And I think that is often missed. But to your question of how you can engage, I think I talk about this a lot. We have a democracy if we're willing to keep it. And that was a famous quote for someone I forgot, but I remember it was famous. And it's so true, because for me, it's democracy happens in living rooms and community meetings and showing up and staying engaged. And it is in those conversations that you really understand what the community needs, and you get to interface with your elected official. And I'd also caution that there are some issues before legislators that are so charged and are so backed by interest groups that our inboxes are flooded with hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of emails that are form emails on a specific issue. That is not effective engagement. I can tell you that if you write my office an email that's thoughtful, even if it's not thoughtful, but if it's just genuine, you can tell it wasn't a form email sent out by some service, you get a response. Because that is what we're really looking for, is to engage in conversation with community. And it just doesn't happen when you're sending hundreds of thousands of form emails, because you end up being part of a tally instead of being part of a conversation.
Absolutely. Also, often if a friend of mine is struggling with something in their local community, trash pickup or neighbor or an issue with their school, and they're talking to me about it, I'll say, well, if you contacted your local elected official, whichever might be relevant, whether it's a school board member or a city council member or a House representative or senator, and they will always 100% of the time they say no, and I say you should. They can help and they want to help, and I think that side of the job is often really forgotten.
I couldn't agree more. I think, and I'll make a little bit of an observation on national politics. I've never served in Congress, and I can tell you from my vantage point, it doesn't feel like a lot of things are happening that really have a tangible effect on your life. But if you talk to a state legislator and have that authentic conversation, either at a community event or through email or calling an office with just a really genuine voicemail, you get a response. And there's so many of us that have the understanding of how to connect people and how to solve problems, and we're willing to do that. You just got to call and ask, and that's part of the job. That's why we campaign so hard to represent community, and why some of us are so excited to do it, myself included. So reach out to us, have that authentic conversation. That's the best way to create real change in your community.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. So let's take a quick ad break, and then when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about community-based advocacy. It is such a tough time for nonprofits, agencies, and changemakers. Funding is tight, capacity is stretched, and your work matters more than ever. And you need communication support that can keep up. That's why we are super excited to introduce our new suite of modular, flexible services, built to help you and your storytelling stay visible, resilient, and connected when it matters the most. Whether you need a quick messaging refresh or adaptable on-demand support, Javelina is here to help you move forward with clarity and strength. You can see this list of services and discounted prices at javelina.co/rapid-response-services. That's javelina.co/rapid-response-services. Okay, Sean, so before the break, we were talking about really the material difference that our electeds do have on our lives, whether it feels like they don't or it feels like they do or not. And I want to ask you a little bit more about the role that you think community-based advocacy plays in driving meaningful change.
I think it's critical. And I'll say this because there are some issues that don't have natural constituencies or corporate interest groups that will champion those issues. But when you get community together on a specific issue or a specific thing that's important for a state, that really drives the conversation. And it typically doesn't happen with one or two people. It happens with lots of people getting together and forming that group and having a really structured and strategic way about talking about it, because that's what everyone else is doing. And if you can get into that conversation, you can drive real change, whether it's on social issues or tax policy or a change you want to see in education. And these are all things that happen when groups of people get together, coalesce around a great idea, and push it forward.
Is there something in your local community you've seen, a movement for change that's been successful because of the people that were involved in it?
There's so many good examples of different things. I can tell you one in particular, and maybe this is a little self-serving because I was part of it. Last year in Colorado, we had a ballot measure to put a fee on ammunition because there was community groups out there that saw a real need for mental health care. And under our Tabor structures, how do we fund mental health care? They got together and put a proposition on the ballot that passed on this fee to fund specifically domestic violence and mental health services that are community-based. Because we are seeing in Colorado, we're an incredibly wealthy state, we're incredibly educated, but we have some of the worst funding for mental health, and it was creating tangible problems on our streets. And this group got together, got something on the ballot, and I was able to pass a law that provided $5 million for veterans, community-based mental health all across the state. And that makes a huge and tangible impact when you think about how many members and friends that we have who have served our country, but are waiting a year for a VA appointment. The state has a role and can step in, and they did, and provided this funding for immediate mental health support for people suffering crises. So we have stronger communities, we have stronger support networks to take care of our citizens, and that's what government's all about. It's very striking to me, I think, in this past session, a lot of folks on the other side of the aisle talk a lot about how if the worst phrase in the world is "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." And I turn that on its head because there's so many of us that are with the government and we are here to help. And that is what we are trying to do, or we wouldn't be doing this work. And I just challenge that notion altogether because I think it's far too easy to dismiss politicians and government in general. But government is us. It is your neighbors and your friends that are getting together and stepping up to do really great things. And I think we should support that.
I love that you shared that example because I think that very often at the moment, there's this palpable sense that everything's going in the wrong direction. And there's this real feeling of despair and loss of hope for not only ourselves and our families, but our future generations, future grandkids, and the people that come after us. And one of the things that I often feel is that there is this incredible work happening on a day-to-day basis in communities around the world that does solve problems and does make a material difference for people. Sometimes you can fix a problem that I may never have thought of and doesn't impact my life, but for somebody else, it impacts their life hugely. And then when it's rectified, things are different. And so I think I have a two-part question for you. One is, what's your view of that? Is the world headed right direction, wrong direction? And then two, how do you manage, how do you stay hopeful and positive when it does feel like there's a lot of headwinds?
I will acknowledge the moment. I think we are in a political moment in this country, at least, where a lot of people feel like we are going in the wrong direction. And I clearly put that on elected officials because we are not telling the story of all the great work we are doing, all the great thought and all the great community engagement that we are doing, because people just naturally distrust government. And it hurts. It sucks, frankly, because we put in so much work to show up for community, and we're just not telling the story. We are not getting our message out there, and it's being lost. And there's something real about when you feel your government or your country isn't heading in the right direction. You have to look to your elected leaders. And I think as an elected leader, we all need to do better in that space. The way we show up, the way we talk, the way we engage with the community. And that is what's going to turn around this feeling that things are going in the wrong direction. Because I think if you look even at your elected official, regardless of where you were, that person was probably doing some really amazing work that just wasn't reported on, or wasn't, just didn't get its 15 minutes on the local news or on social media or whatever else. But that probably has real tangible impacts on your life in a probably good way. I mean, I think, um, so I would put that on elected officials. We need to do a better job of telling the story. And I think for me, when you work really hard on a bill and you just get that little bit of positive feedback, or out of the thousands of emails of saying how much you suck and what, you just did a horrible job, that one really well-placed email that says, hey, you made a difference in my life, and that just keeps me going. So it is a life of a public servant to catch all the criticism. But it's in those moments around the fringes where you can make a real difference in people's lives that just keeps me going.
Well, I couldn't agree more, because personally, I just believe if there's one thing that it changes the world, it is story, and it is stories. How can elected officials, but really just more broadly community leaders, tell their story effectively? What does that look like for you, and what advice would you give other people?
I think just being authentic. I think it's where a lot of elected officials are stuck behind polls or how to message something. But if you just show up and like, hey, I'm Sean from East Denver, and I did this really great thing, and it was really hard, and I did it for you. So, for example, I was able to do something really nerdy with our retirement savings for the state, because Denver public school teachers over the last 10 years have paid over $1 billion more than every other teacher in the state into their retirement fund by a feature of state law. And what we were able to do is turn that $1 billion overpayment into a $2,500 pay raise for every teacher, staff member in Denver public schools. And it's the largest employer, one of the largest employers in Denver. And that makes a tangible impact when you talk about, I need to live and work in the community, in my community. $2,500 goes a long way. That increases people's ability to live where they want and live the life they want. And that is something that's probably not going to get a lot of airtime. But man, you talk to some teachers in Denver, and they're probably going to be really, really excited about that. And hopefully the governor is able to sign it soon so we can get a little bit of press coverage on it. But it's going to have a real tangible effect, and it just doesn't get out there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that those stories don't get told, and finding ways to seek them out. I guess for anybody who is actively engaged in their community and they want to know more about the positive laws and changes that are being made, where would you send them to find out?
That's hard.
Yeah.
Because I think when you're trying to find these little nuggets of great things that are happening, they're all over the place, and there's not a real great consolidated place. You can always look to your local elected official. Everyone has a newsletter. I have a newsletter. You can go to my website and sign up for it. And I try to tell that story every chance I get. I think going on social media and different things is a little dicey, but I think you just have to stay engaged. And here's a great idea. Talk to your elected official. Go to a town hall. If you go to a town hall and ask any elected official something great that happened, you're going to get probably a very surprising answer and something that was not covered. And it takes a little bit more legwork, and it's a little harder to access. But a lot of these town halls are on YouTube, or put up virtually at the same time. So there's ways to find it. And I would challenge whoever's listening to this podcast, go find your local elected official, connect on their website, and there's probably many different ways in which you can engage in a town hall or otherwise, and you can learn about this great work that's happening without the filter of a social media or a news source with an agenda. And it's just community members out there trying to tell the story.
Well, I love that. So to wrap us up, Sean, you actually queued that up perfectly for me. So I have my 4 speed round questions for you. What is a resource that you would recommend for people who want to learn more about some of the things that we've been talking about today?
Well, I kind of mentioned it, but I think local news often gets a bad rap because their newsrooms are smaller and their teams have to be more nimble. But I think what I saw this past session is local news, and your local paper, your local whatever, does a really good job, or attempts to do a really good job of covering some of these things. So look for some of those more local news sources, not necessarily on social media, but here in Colorado, we have the Colorado Sun, we have the Denver Post does a great job. Some of these local sources that are really close to the action tend to do an end of session wrap up, and they talk about the big themes of the legislative session and some of the bills that flew under the radar. We also have great local podcasts that are, and I know they're in every community. Check out some of those sources because I think that's where you're going to find some real gems.
I love that. And what is a way that people listening can think differently about some of the things we've been talking about?
Embrace the other side. And I think we often get so stuck in our silos. Whether you're a Democrat, go watch Fox News. And you may not agree with anything that they're saying, but you need to know what they're saying because there's a significant portion of the population that does believe it. And if you are not open in your mind about what that message looks like or how to tell your story better, you're just missing an opportunity. So challenge yourself to go read something, even if you disagree with it, because some people do, and you really have to have that open mind. So if you're a Democrat, go look at Fox News. If you're a Republican, go watch MSNBC or, listen to a politician from another party. And I think you can learn a lot that way.
And what is something that people can do to make a difference on the local level?
Show up. And this is something I mentioned earlier, but you can never say this enough. We have a democracy, and I think far too often we feel like it's going the wrong direction or it's, we're one small misstep away from losing it. But we won't be there if you show up, if you remain engaged. Now is not the time to disengage and just hope for things to get better or however you view them. But if you not even authentically, just show up, be part of the conversation. And that is a way you can make a real difference.
And lastly, Sean, how can people connect with you?
Well, as every politician, you can reach out to me at my official email. You can find me on social media at Sean Camacho CO on X, Camacho for Colorado on Instagram, Sean Camacho on Blue Sky. You can find me on Facebook. I like to say, like Coach Prime, I'm not hard to find. You can locate me. So please do.
Sean, thank you so much for joining us for this great conversation. I just loved talking about how people actually can make a difference and that there aren't always the barriers to our elected officials and our representatives that we think there are. But also, I just want to thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being elected. Thank you for taking all of that rough with whatever little bit of smooth there is involved in being an elected representative. I'm so very grateful to you and to your colleagues for working very hard on our behalf.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to have had this opportunity with you and your audience. So I'm really thankful for that. There you have it, another wonderful conversation, and I am so incredibly grateful to Sean. Right from the very beginning, he gave me things that I was just like, yes, this is exactly right. When he talked about the importance of perseverance, that perseverance is so incredibly important in making change. And even in telling us his story about how he got elected and how he had to lose a couple of times before he was successful, that failure is a part of success. And if you want to drive change in the world, you have to persevere. There is no way around it. And I think that is just such an incredible, incredible lesson. As I shared with Sean in the podcast, I just feel that so often people talk about how politicians don't care and how voters don't care. And I never find either of those things to be true. And so some of the stories that he shared and the examples he shared were such incredible demonstrations of that. And I think his calls to action that he shared with us is really great advice. So I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please share it with someone else you think might find it valuable. And I would appreciate it greatly if you would give us a rating and review on whatever platform you listen to. It really helps us reach new people. Until next time, when I cannot wait to share another story of change with you, I hope you have a great one.